Vivid verses.
They fired me on a Tuesday, which should have told them something. Tuesdays are for decisions people haven't fully thought through. Mondays are too fresh. Fridays too eager to be done. Tuesday means someone convinced themselves overnight and wanted to move before the feeling passed. I sat across from Donald Ashworth, our VP of Operations, and a woman from HR named Priya Chandrasekharan who kept a legal pad in front of her that she never once wrote on. The office was the same as always: gray carpet tile, a window that didn't open, a framed print of a compass rose that someone in facilities had decided said something about direction and leadership. I'd looked at that print for 11 years. I never liked it. "We've decided to restructure the system's integration role," Donald said. He had a way of talking that suggested he'd practiced the sentence in his car. "Effective today. We really appreciate everything you've—" "I understand," I said. He blinked. People always expect the pushback first, the negotiation, the wounded pride. I learned a long time ago that reacting in the moment gives everyone in the room a story to tell later. He got so upset, he practically begged us to reconsider. I didn't intend to give him a story. I intended to let the paperwork do the talking, because the paperwork was the only part of this room that actually worked in my favor. "We'll of course process your final pay according to policy," Priya said, sliding a folder toward me. 2 weeks severance, per your original offer letter." "That's not my severance structure," I said. She frowned, glanced at the folder like it might correct itself. "I'm sorry, I signed an amended agreement in 2019. Section 14. You'll want to pull the executed copy from legal, not the template HR keeps on file." Donald's jaw did something small and involuntary. "What amended agreement?" "You'll find it," I said and stood up. "I'd get moving on that today if I were you." I left my badge on the desk, walked to my car, and drove home without checking my phone once. Not because I didn't care what was in it, because I already knew, more or less, what was coming, and there was no version of that afternoon improved by watching arrive in real time. 11 years earlier, I'd been the fourth hire in a systems integration group that didn't have a name yet, working for a company that made industrial control software for manufacturing plants. The unglamorous kind of software nobody thinks about until a conveyor line stops moving and $6 million an hour starts bleeding out through the ceiling. I built the architecture that let 3 incompatible legacy systems talk to each other without anyone having to rip out 40-year-old hardware. I was good at it. Better than good. I was the only person in the building who understood how all 3 pieces fit together, because I'd been the one who fit them. By year 3, I understood something else. I was irreplaceable in a way the company hadn't priced in yet, and companies that don't price in your value will eventually try to take it from you for free. So when my contract came up for its 5-year renewal, I didn't ask for a raise. I asked for a lawyer. Her name was Odalise Ferreira, and she specialized in something most employment attorneys never touch: technical retention clauses. Golden handcuffs, but built to swing both ways. Over 3 weeks, we drafted language that looked, to anyone skimming it, like standard boilerplate. It wasn't. Section 14 guaranteed that if my employment was terminated without cause, I retained a non-revocable consulting retainer at 4 times my prior hourly rate, invoked automatically the moment any system I'd architected required intervention I hadn't personally trained a successor to perform. Section 16 specified that the company was contractually barred from reverse engineering, replicating, or materially modifying the integration layer without my written consent for a period of 7 years, under penalty of a liquidated damages clause that would make the number on the invoice look like a rounding error. Section 19, the one Donald and Priya clearly hadn't found yet, stipulated that any termination, layoff, or restructuring that removed me from the role triggered a 90-day emergency support obligation on their part, meaning they had to pay me whether they called or not, and if they didn't call, the clock just kept running against systems nobody else understood. I hadn't negotiated that contract because I distrusted the company. I negotiated it because I understood something most people don't let themselves believe about the place they work. Loyalty is not mutual by default. It has to be engineered the same way I engineered everything else. And if the company wasn't going to build loyalty into the relationship, I would build protection into it instead. For 8 years, nobody at the company thought about Section 14 because nobody had a reason to. I did my job. I trained no successor because nobody asked me to, and it wasn't my job to volunteer the company's own negligence back to them. I kept copies of every signed page in 3 separate places, and I waited, without particularly expecting to need any of it, for the day someone decided I was replaceable. The first call came at 6:47 that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Not out of theater. I was making dinner, and there was nothing in the next 10 minutes that couldn't wait 10 minutes. When I finally listened, it was Priya, her voice noticeably tighter than it had been that afternoon. "Hi, it's Priya again. Could you give me a call back when you get a chance? We're just trying to sort out a few things on our end." The second call, 40 minutes later, was Donald himself. "Hey, look, I think there might have been a miscommunication earlier today. Can we grab 5 minutes? I called him back at 9, after the kitchen was clean and my daughter had gone to bed. "Donald, hey, thanks for calling back. So we pulled the file you mentioned. The 2019 amendment. A pause, the sound of someone choosing words with visible effort. There's some language in there that legal's flagging as pretty unusual. It's not unusual. It's specific, right? Well, the support obligation piece. We got a situation. Plant 14's integration layer threw an unhandled fault around for this afternoon, and it's cascaded into the scheduling system. We've got 3 shifts backed up, and nobody here can find a root fault. Marcus says it's something in the middleware you built, but nobody's touched that code in years. Nobody's supposed to have needed to, I said. That was the point. Another pause, longer this time. Can you come in tomorrow? We'll figure out compensation. Obviously, we want to make this right. No to tomorrow, or no, I won't be coming in. If you want emergency support under Section 14, that's a separate engagement at the specified rate with a signed statement of work. I can have Odalise send the paperwork over tonight. Tonight's a little. Can we just talk about? Donald, the plant's been down for 5 hours. Every hour you spend trying to talk me into a discount is an hour the line stays stopped. That math isn't going to change by arguing with me about it." He went quiet. I could hear, faintly, someone in the background asking him something urgent, the particular tone of a room where people are starting to understand the size of a mistake. "Send the paperwork," he said finally. The statement of work went out at 9:40 p.m. For times my old hourly rate, a minimum 4-hour engagement, remote diagnostic only. I wasn't driving back into that building the same week they'd walk me out of it. Payment terms net immediate via wire, not net 30, because I had no interest in becoming an unsecured creditor to a company that had just demonstrated, in writing, how quickly it forgot its obligations. They signed within 20 minutes. I diagnosed the fault by 11 p.m., a race condition in the handoff between the scheduling module and the legacy PLC interface, the kind of thing that only reveals itself under specific load conditions I documented extensively in a technical appendix nobody had apparently read in 8 years. I sent Marcus, their remaining systems engineer, a fix and a 2-paragraph explanation of why it had happened. Line was running again by midnight. My invoice cleared their accounts payable system with unusual speed for a company that historically paid contractors on a 60-day cycle. I didn't hear from them again for 11 days. I used those 11 days to file the paperwork for my own company. I called it Faro Systems Consulting. Nothing clever, nothing that tried too hard to sound disruptive. I'd spent 11 years watching companies chase branding when what they actually needed was competence, and I had no intention of repeating their mistake. I rented a small office above a print shop, bought exactly the equipment I needed and nothing more, and reached out to 4 former colleagues who'd left the company over the years for reasons that all rhymed with mine. Underpaid, underprotected, eventually discarded once someone decided their institutional knowledge was a line item instead of an asset. 2 of them joined me within the month. A third, a woman named Talia Oheen, who'd run quality assurance on the same systems I'd built, came on as a part-time consultant while she finished out her notice somewhere else. By the time the company called me a second time, I had a functioning business, 3 clients who weren't my former employer, and a name on the door that owed nothing to anyone. The second call came 6 weeks later. Different voice this time, Renata Kessler, the chief operating officer, someone I'd met exactly twice in 11 years, both times in meetings where I'd been introduced as our systems guy and then not spoken to again. I wanted to reach out personally, she said in the voice of someone who'd been told that personal outreach fixes things. I think there was a real failure process when your role was eliminated. And I want to talk about bringing you back, full-time senior architect, whatever title makes sense to you. We'd make it worth your while. I'm not interested in coming back. Can I ask why? I could have told her a dozen true things. That I didn't trust an organization that had shown me exactly how it treated the people who held it together. That I built something of my own in 6 weeks that felt more honest than 11 years of theirs. That there was no title, however senior, that repaired the fact that Donald and Priya had sat across from me and offered 2 weeks severance like they were doing me a favor. But explaining any of that would have sounded like an appeal for sympathy or worse, an invitation to negotiate around it. I wasn't interested in either. I've started my own business, I said. It's going well. If you have a specific technical need, I'm available to consult, same terms as before, hourly, statement of work paid on delivery. Otherwise, I don't think there's much to discuss. What if we match your consulting rate as a salary? Then I'd be trading a business I own for a salary I don't. That's not a trade I'm interested in making. She tried a few more angles, flexibility, equity, a vague reference to making this right that never specified what right would look like in dollar terms. I let her finish each one before declining, without heat, without repeating myself more than necessary. Eventually, she thanked me for my time in a voice that suggested she wasn't used to conversations ending on someone else's terms, and we hung up. I didn't gloat about the call to my team. I didn't need to. Talia had been in the room when I took it, and she just looked at me afterward and said, "They still don't get it, do they?" "No," I said, "but they will. It just costs more each time they don't." The third call, the one that mattered, came 4 months later, and it didn't come from Donald or Renata. It came from the CEO himself, a man named Griffin Whitlock, who I'd spoken to maybe 6 times in 11 years, always in the context of a quarterly all-hands where he stood at the front of a room and used words like synergy and headcount optimization without apparent irony. He didn't call. He showed up. I was in my office reviewing a contract for a new client, a mid-sized food packaging company that needed exactly the kind of integration work I'd spent a decade perfecting, when Talia knocked and told me there was someone downstairs asking for me by name, no appointment. Griffin Whitlock looked smaller in my building than he had in his. That's a thing that happens to people who are used to hallways built to make them look important. Outside of that architecture, they're just a man in an expensive coat standing in a stairwell that smelled faintly of the print shop's toner. "I won't take much of your time," he said, once I'd let him into the office and closed the door. "I think you know why I'm here. I have a guess. Plant 14's integration failed again 3 weeks ago. Different fault this time, apparently worse. We brought in an outside firm, spent close to $400,000 over 3 weeks, and they couldn't get the middleware stable. Marcus resigned 2 weeks ago. I understand he's coming to work for you. He starts Monday. Griffin nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer, and it still cost him something to hear confirmed. I'll be direct. We need you. Not as a favor, not as a consulting engagement here and there. We need the architecture stabilized long term. And right now, there is no one inside our company who can do that. I'm prepared to offer you whatever it takes. Title, compensation, autonomy. I came here myself because I wanted you to understand that this isn't Donald's mess anymore. It's mine, and I'm the one asking. I'll let the silence sit for a second before answering, not for effect, but because it was worth actually thinking about, and thinking takes a moment even when the answer isn't going to change. I appreciate you coming in person, I said. I mean that, but I'm not coming back to work for the company. Not as an employee, not under any title. Something in his face tightened, not anger, more like a man recalculating a budget in real time. Then what would it take? Just tell me what you actually want, and I'll try to make it happen. You're asking the wrong question, I said. You're trying to figure out what number turns me back into an employee. There isn't one. What I can offer you is what I've already offered twice. A consulting engagement structured the way I structure them, and my rate on my schedule with clear scope. If you want long-term stability for that system, I can build it for you as a client relationship, not as your employee. What would that look like? A retainer. Quarterly, paid in advance, not net anything. Scope defined by me based on what the system actually needs, not by whoever's panicking that week. No on-call obligation outside business hours unless it's billed as emergency response at emergency rates. And I choose who from my team works the account, which, going forward, might include Marcus, but that's my call, not yours. He was quiet for a moment. I could see him doing the math that every executive eventually does when the alternative is another $400,000 spent achieving nothing. And if we agree to that, then I'll stabilize the system. I'll do it well, because that's how I work regardless of who's paying me. But I want to be clear about something, because I don't think anyone in that building has fully understood it yet, even now. I lean back. This isn't a relationship where you have leverage over me anymore. You have a system you don't understand, built by someone you decided was disposable. Every time it breaks, you'll need me. And every time you need me, the terms will be mine. That's not a threat. That's just the shape of what happened when you cut me loose without reading what you'd signed. He didn't argue with that. To his credit, he didn't try to. He just nodded once, the way people do when they've stopped negotiating with reality and started accepting it. Send the retainer terms, he said. I'll sign whatever you send. The contract went out that afternoon. Griffin signed it within the hour. No red lines, no counteroffer, which told me more about the state of Plant 14 than any conversation could have. I structured the retainer to give Faro Systems Consulting a quarterly engagement worth more than my old annual salary, for roughly a fifth of the hours I used to work. Marcus took point on the account under my supervision, which meant that within a year, someone finally had the documentation and training I'd never been asked to provide the first time around. Except now the company was paying premium rates for the privilege of getting what should have been free 11 years earlier. Word travels in industries this small. Two other manufacturers who'd heard through supplier gossip about the guy who fired his old company off a cliff reached out inside the next quarter. Not because I'm marketed for it, but because nothing sells competence like a public demonstration of what happens when a company loses it. Faro Systems grew from 4 people to 11 within 18 months. I hired 2 more former colleagues, brought Odalise on as permanent outside counsel for every contract we drafted going forward. Because if there was one lesson worth institutionalizing, it was that one. The 4th time the company needed me was different, and it's the one I think about when I try to explain to anyone who asks what actually changed. It was a Thursday, almost 2 years after the termination. Renata Kessler called. Not Griffin this time, not Donald, who I later heard had quietly left the company not long after Plant 14's second collapse. In the kind of departure companies describe as pursuing other opportunities, when what they mean is we needed someone to blame, and it wasn't going to be the CEO. We have a problem that isn't in your retainer scope, Renata said. Her voice had lost the practiced warmth from our first call. This was someone talking to a peer now, not managing a difficult employee. We're acquiring a smaller competitor, and their plants run on a completely different control architecture. We need someone to assess whether it's compatible with our systems before the deal closes, and we need it in 3 weeks. That's a scoping engagement, not retainer work, I said. I can put together a proposal. How much? I told her. It wasn't a small number. Due diligence work under deadline pressure never is. But it was fair, and more importantly, it was mine to set, because nobody else in that building had to stand in to argue with the price of expertise they'd already proven they couldn't do without. Done, she said without hesitation, and I remember thinking in that moment that this was the actual shape of what I'd built. Not revenge, not even really vindication in the way people imagine it. Just a market functioning the way it should have functioned the entire time I'd worked there, before anyone decided that loyalty could be a one-way expectation. I brought Talia onto the acquisition assessment. We found what I suspected we'd find. The competitor systems weren't just incompatible. They were held together by an even more precarious version of the exact problem the company had once had with me. One overworked engineer who understood everything and had never been asked to document any of it, because nobody had ever priced in what he was worth until the day he'd inevitably leave too. I put that in my report plainly, without editorializing. Renata read it and, to her credit, understood exactly what I was showing her without my needing to underline it. "You're telling us we're about to make the same mistake twice," she said, on the call where we walked through my findings. "I'm telling you what the data says," I said. "What you do with it is yours to decide. Would you take him on? Their lead engineer, if the deal closes. That's not what I was hired to assess. But if you want a recommendation, yes. Talk to him before the deal closes, not after. Find out what he actually needs to feel secure in his position, and put it in writing in a contract he understands before you assume he'll just stay because you bought the building he works in." She was quiet for a moment. "That's oddly generous advice coming from you." "It's not generous," I said. "It's just correct. I'm not interested in watching you make the same mistake with someone else. Not because I feel sorry for him. Because a company that keeps discarding the people who hold it together is going to keep needing consultants like me, and honestly, at some point that stops being interesting work. I'd rather you learn the lesson than keep paying me to clean up after you not learning it." She laughed, a short, surprised sound. That might be the most honest thing anyone said to me in this building in a decade. It usually is, once people stop trying to manage how you feel about them. The acquisition closed. I don't know exactly what Renata told their new engineer, or what terms he ended up with, but I heard through Marcus, months later, that the man was still there and that the transition had gone about as smoothly as those things ever go. I choose to believe that had something to do with the conversation Renata and I had, though I've never asked, and it isn't really my business anymore. My business, the actual one, with my name absent from the door, but my judgment stamped through every contract we write, was doing something the old company had never quite managed with me. It was mine, structured the way I wanted it structured, growing at a pace I chose, protected by clauses I'd written myself, with people around me who I'd chosen because I trusted them, not because HR had assigned them to my floor. Griffin Whitlock still calls occasionally, always for something real, never for small talk, because he learned early that small talk with me was a waste of both our time. The retainer renews every year without incident. Every renewal, I review the terms with Odalise, and every year I adjust them slightly upward, not out of spite, but because the market for what I do has only ever moved in one direction, and I see no reason to leave that value sitting on the table out of nostalgia for a company that never once in 11 years considered doing the same for me. Sometimes I think about that afternoon in Donald's office. The Compass Rose print, the 2-week severance offered like a kindness, the particular blankness on his face when I told him to check Section 14. I don't think about it with anger. I never did. Not really, not even in the first hour after I left the building. Anger would have meant I was surprised, and I wasn't. I'd spent 11 years watching how that company treated the people who built it, and I'd spent 3 weeks with a lawyer 8 years earlier making sure that whatever came next, I wouldn't be at the mercy of their forgetting. That's the part people never quite understand when they hear the story secondhand. The version that gets passed around at industry conferences now, slightly exaggerated, slightly mythologized, the guy who got fired and built an empire out of spite. It wasn't spite. It was never spite. It wasn't spite. It was never spite. It was just preparation applied patiently over a long enough timeline that by the time anyone needed to reckon with it, the reckoning was already finished and all that was left was the paperwork. Griffin called again last month. Different problem this time. Nothing catastrophic, just a scheduled system upgrade they wanted my sign-off on before proceeding. A courtesy more than a necessity, since Section 16's 7-year window on modification consent had only recently lapsed. You know you don't need my approval anymore, I told him. That clause expired in the spring. There was a pause on the line, and then something that might have been the beginning of a laugh. I know, he said. I called anyway. I appreciated that, in a way I hadn't expected to. Not because I needed the validation. I'd built plenty of proof by then that didn't require his acknowledgement, but because it meant he'd finally understood something it had taken the company the better part of a decade and several very expensive lessons to learn. That respect, once withheld, doesn't come back cheap. And once you understand what you actually have, you don't wait for the contract to force your hand before you start treating it that way. Send me the upgrade specs, I said. I'll take a look this week. No charge. Call it professional courtesy. You're not going to bill us. Not for this. Consider it a gift. The kind you should have been giving people all along before you learned you had to buy it back at 4 times the price. He didn't say anything for a moment, and then, quietly, understood. I hung up, finished the report I've been drafting for a new client, and looked out at the street below my office. My building, my name on the lease, my terms written into every page of every contract my company signed. Nobody had handed me any of it. I'd built it the same way I built everything else. Patiently, without asking anyone's permission, protecting the value I created long before anyone else recognized it was there to protect. That, in the end, was the only lesson worth taking from any of it. Not that I'd won something, because winning implies a contest, and there had never really been one. Just a company that hadn't read its own contract, and a man who had written it to survive precisely this. The company had spent 2 years learning, expensively one collapse at a time, what I'd known since the day I signed Section 14. That leverage isn't something you fight for in the moment you need it. It's something you build years in advance, quietly, while everyone around you assumes the relationship will always run in their favor. They know better now. It cost them considerably more than it would have cost them to simply treat me fairly the first time. But some lessons only take when they're expensive, and I'd stop being the one responsible for teaching it any other way.
Thanks for listening.